Hello, Aquarius. March often carries a very particular kind of energy, not the kind of change that arrives loudly or something everyone notices right away. It feels more like a soft breeze moving quietly through our lives, just enough to make a few familiar things suddenly feel worth reflecting on. Many of us have experienced a strange feeling in relationships. When everything is still close, when people are still part of our daily rhythm, we rarely pause to look deeply at the value we bring to each other. Conversations, pieces of advice, those simple moments of showing up for someone, they often feel like nothing more than ordinary parts of life. Until one day, distance appears. And somehow, that distance begins to make certain memories clearer. For Aquarius, March sometimes carries this kind of quiet energy. A moment that invites someone to look back and perhaps realize things they never fully understood before. This story today isn't about who was right or who was wrong. It's simply a small journey of reflection, a chance to think about value, about presence, about the quiet impact one human being can have in another person's life. And what's interesting is this: some values only become truly visible when a little distance appears between two people, just enough space for everything to finally come into clearer focus. March enters the life of Aquarius like the first light of morning touching a window, unhurried, not drawing much attention, just a subtle shift in the air, enough to make us pause for a few seconds and sense that something, somewhere, is quietly moving. Many of us have lived through seasons like this, in moments when life still seems perfectly normal. Work continues, conversations flow, familiar meetings come and go. And in the middle of all that routine, someone's presence can become something very natural. So natural that almost no one stops to ask, what does this person truly bring into my life? It isn't indifference. It's simply that human beings tend to grow used to the things that are always there. Someone who listens, someone who understands the story behind the words, someone who sees the world from a wider, deeper perspective. For many Aquarius souls, that way of being is almost second nature. You often step into people's lives with a quiet sense of calm that feels uniquely your own. No need to try to impress anyone. No need to stand at the center of every conversation. You simply show up. And sometimes, that quiet presence becomes something deeply valuable before anyone even realizes it. Life has an interesting way of teaching us about value. It doesn't always explain things with words. More often, it uses distance. One day, a familiar conversation stops happening. A piece of advice you used to hear no longer appears. Someone who used to be there is no longer there in quite the same way. And inside that silence, memory begins to move in a strange and thoughtful way. People start remembering the smallest details. A sentence that stayed with them all day. A moment when someone listened without judgment. A perspective that made them feel understood. Things that once seemed completely ordinary suddenly begin to carry a deeper meaning. For Aquarius, your journey rarely revolves around proving who you are. You're not the kind of person who constantly explains yourself, and you're not the type who needs everyone to understand you right away. Many Aquarius souls choose a simpler path, to live honestly, to hold on to kindness, and to keep walking forward in their own quiet way. Yet, life has a very gentle way of revealing the value of sincerity. Sometimes only after time has passed, people begin to realize that someone once gave them more than they ever noticed in the moment. Not in a loud way, not in a showy way, but like soft afternoon light filling a quiet room. We only notice how important that light was when the room begins to grow a little darker. And perhaps for some Aquarius souls, March carries a moment like that. A moment that invites a few people to look back, not to regret anything, not to rewrite the past, and simply to understand more deeply the value of someone who once passed through their life. And sometimes the most thought-provoking part isn't the distance itself, but the way that distance quietly reveals a simple truth. There are people whose presence once felt ordinary, until one day we begin to understand just how much meaning they had all along. Every person leaves a very unique imprint in the lives of others. Some arrive like a storm, powerful, unforgettable. Others appear quietly, like a slow stream moving through ordinary days. Aquarius often belongs to the second kind. You don't necessarily need to be the most noticeable person in the room. You don't need to speak the most to be heard. The presence of Aquarius often feels more like space, a wide, calm space where others can breathe, think, and simply be themselves. And in many relationships, that role can be almost invisible, a conversation that stretches late into the night, a gentle reminder that makes someone reconsider a decision, a new perspective when everything once seemed stuck. Moments like these usually pass by very naturally. No one writes them down. No one stands up and announces, "This moment is important." They simply become part of everyday life. Yet life has a way of slowing people down at certain moments. Maybe it happens on an evening that feels quieter than usual, a day when everything suddenly seems more still, or a moment when someone realizes a familiar conversation is no longer happening the way it once did. And then memory begins to work in a very delicate way. Things that once felt completely ordinary start returning to the mind. A simple sentence that once made them see life differently. A piece of advice quiet, yet sincere. A way of listening that made them feel respected and understood. Little details like these sometimes feel like small pieces of light scattered across memory. During the day, we hardly notice them. But when night arrives, that light becomes clearer. And that is often when people begin to realize that certain connections once held more meaning than they first understood. This realization doesn't always come from loss or regret. Sometimes it is simply a very human moment of awareness. The realization that someone once entered their life with a rare kind of sincerity. And the interesting thing about Aquarius is this. You rarely try to create that feeling on purpose. You're not the type of person who chases attention at any cost. More often, you simply bring something very simple into people's lives. True presence. Someone willing to listen. Someone who doesn't rush to judge. Someone capable of seeing a situation from many different angles. And sometimes, that quiet, steady presence becomes something people begin to miss only after it's no longer there in the same way. Human beings often recognize the value of something at the most unexpected moments, not while everything is still happening, but in a quiet pause, when they look back at the path they've already walked. And along that path, they begin to realize that some conversations that once seemed very small actually carried more meaning than they ever realized at the time. So, sometimes the story is not about Aquarius changing. It's about the other person's perspective slowly growing. When perspective changes, memory changes too. Things that once felt ordinary begin to appear like small points of light along the journey of a life. And from those small lights, a very natural question can quietly form in someone's mind. Have there been important things in my life that I once walked past too quickly, without ever truly pausing long enough to understand their value? And then, within the quiet flow of memories that have just been awakened, something else sometimes begins to appear. Silence. Not the heavy kind of silence, not coldness, not distance meant to cut someone off. Just a very gentle step back. If you've ever known an Aquarius in your life, you might recognize this quite clearly. Aquarius rarely leaves through loud arguments, rarely chooses harsh words just to prove a point. Instead, Aquarius often chooses something different. A small step back, a moment to breathe, a space wide enough for everything to settle on its own. To an outside observer, it may look completely ordinary. No dramatic goodbye, no words that suddenly make the room tense. And yet, sometimes that calmness leaves behind a space that is strangely hard to name. Because when someone has grown used to your presence, used to the way you listen more than you judge, used to the way you see situations from a wider perspective, your absence is rarely noticed right away. It arrives slowly, almost like when a familiar clock in a room suddenly stops ticking. At first, everything seems the same, until one moment, someone realizes the room has grown quieter than usual, and inside that quiet, a question begins to appear. What did I miss? This question rarely comes from dramatic regret. It usually arrives in a very human moment of reflection, an evening when memories return, a longer than usual drive down a quiet road, a pause when the mind begins gently arranging pieces of the past. And in those moments, people sometimes begin to realize that certain individuals once brought a very special balance into their lives. not by demanding attention, but by creating a space safe enough for others to simply be themselves. That is something many Aquarius souls carry naturally, a quiet calm, a deeply human perspective, a way of seeing the world not only through personal desire, but through a wider picture. Qualities like these rarely attract attention immediately. They are more like soft afternoon light filling a quiet room. We grow so used to that light that we forget it's even there, until one day the light is gone. For some Aquarius, March can carry an energy that makes these quiet spaces a little more visible, not to pull anyone back into the past, not to make anyone feel regret. Life rarely moves in such simple ways, but distance sometimes works like a mirror. It allows people to look back at their journey from a new perspective, to remember conversations once shared, to remember the people who once passed through their lives. And sometimes, within that reflection, people begin to understand something deeper, that certain connections, even when they change shape, can leave very lasting marks in the heart. Not marks of regret, but marks of growth, because every person who enters our lives in some way brings a lesson. And for those who have crossed paths with a truly sincere Aquarius, that lesson is rarely found in loud words, and it is found in stillness, in the way you look at life with an open heart, a kind of quiet presence that one day makes someone pause and wonder, are there connections in life whose true value we only begin to understand once everything has grown just a little quieter? After moments of silence like that, something else sometimes begins to appear in the human mind, understanding, but a kind of understanding that arrives a little later. Not the kind that happens instantly while everything is still unfolding, but the kind of realization that comes after enough time has passed, after things have had a chance to settle. Somewhere in your life, there may be someone experiencing a moment just like that, an evening when they begin looking back at their journey, an old memory suddenly returning, a conversation that once felt completely ordinary, now carrying a different meaning. And in that reflection, they begin to understand things they never truly saw before. Not in a dramatic way, not with a heavy sense of regret, just a quiet realization that perhaps Aquarius once brought more into their life than they understood at the time. Because the way Aquarius sees the world is often a little different. You tend to think a little wider, look a little deeper, and sometimes ask questions that others have never thought to ask. In the busy rhythm of everyday life, perspectives like that are not always understood right away. People are usually focused on what's in front of them: work, pressure, decisions that must be made quickly. And within that fast-moving current, deep conversations can sometimes pass by like a soft breeze, one until time moves forward, and people begin to look back. Life has a very interesting way of teaching us about understanding. It rarely arrives at the exact moment we expect. Sometimes it requires distance, a stretch of road, a few new experiences. Only then do people begin to look at the past from a wider perspective. Words they once heard but never fully understood suddenly begin to make sense. Ideas that once confused them start to feel worth reflecting on. This doesn't mean the past has changed. The past remains exactly as it was. What changes is the way we see it. Growth often arrives very quietly. It doesn't need a big moment to announce itself. Sometimes all it takes is a single thought appearing in the mind. Maybe back then, I didn't fully understand. And what's interesting is that when understanding finally arrives, it often carries a deeply human feeling with it. Not the desire to go back and fix what has already happened. Life rarely offers that chance, but it offers something else, a deeper perspective on people, on connection, on the encounters that once took place. For many Aquarius souls, your journey tends to carry this unique quality. You plant ideas in people's lives, perspectives, conversations that stay in someone's mind a little longer than expected. And sometimes, it takes time for those seeds to begin growing in another person's thoughts. Not because you were trying to change them, but because a sincere perspective sometimes needs time to be understood. So, if somewhere in this wide world there is someone who has begun reflecting on conversations they once had with you, that doesn't necessarily mean the past is returning. It may simply be a very human sign of growth, A moment when someone begins to understand more clearly the people who once passed through their life and the quiet lessons they carried with them along the way. While somewhere out there, someone may just be beginning to look back at the past. Life for Aquarius often continues moving forward, not because you are trying to forget anything, not because you don't care, but deep down, many Aquarius souls understand something quietly powerful. Life always opens new doors at the moment they are meant to appear, and when a new door opens, your instinct is often to step through it, gently, but with clarity. That is one of the quiet strengths of Aquarius. You can look back at the past with appreciation, yet you rarely allow the past to hold you in place for too long, because somewhere deep inside, Aquarius carries a clear sense that life still holds many things ahead, waiting to be explored. Maybe it's a new idea, a different path, a way of seeing life that feels wiser than before. And along that journey, many Aquarius begin to learn something very important. Your value is not measured by how many people recognize you. The value of a human being is often much simpler than that. It lives in your ability to remain true to what you believe is right, to hold on to kindness even when no one is watching, to keep your sincerity even when the world around you sometimes moves too fast. That path is not always easy. In a world where attention often becomes the measure of everything, where the loudest voices are heard first, where success is expected to look obvious and visible, the path of sincerity can seem quiet. But inside that quietness, and many Aquarius begin to discover their real strength. You don't need to prove yourself constantly. The people who truly understand you, the ones who can look deeper than the surface of things, often feel the truth in their own way. And those who don't see it yet may simply be walking a different part of their journey. Life rarely brings everyone to the same understanding at the same moment. Each person moves at their own rhythm. Some recognize value immediately. Others need more time. And some need an entire journey before they understand the meaning of things that once seemed very simple. When you see life this way, everything begins to feel lighter. There is no longer the urge to convince someone, no pressure to be understood right away. Only the quiet choice to keep walking forward with calm. Life sometimes feels like the night sky Aquarius so often loves to look at. At first glance, we only notice the brightest stars, but if we stay there a little longer, if our eyes slowly adjust to the darkness, the sky begins to reveal far more than we expected. Smaller stars begin to appear. Constellations start connecting into shapes strange, yet beautiful. And we begin to realize the sky had always been that vast. We simply needed time to see it. People are much the same. Some will understand you the moment they meet you. Others may need a much longer journey to see your value more fully. And that doesn't reduce your worth. It simply reflects that everyone is learning to see the world at their own pace. As for Aquarius, while those realizations are slowly unfolding somewhere, you are often still moving forward. Stepping ahead with your familiar calm, stepping ahead with new thoughts, and sometimes with a more mature version of yourself, like someone standing beneath a vast night sky, knowing that ahead there are still many stars waiting to be discovered. And after all the silence, the memories, the shifting perspectives, perhaps the story eventually returns to something very simple, the true value of a human being. In life, many people have felt the desire to be understood right away, to have their efforts seen, to have their sincerity recognized the moment it appears. But time often teaches us something very different. True understanding rarely arrives in a rushed moment. It's more like the light of sunrise. At first, just a thin line of brightness along the horizon. And slowly, as time passes, the entire sky begins to open with light. For many Aquarius souls, the journey of growth often unfolds in a similar way. You begin to realize that you don't need to chase recognition from every direction. You don't need to explain yourself to everyone, because the people who are truly able to understand you often find their way to that understanding in their own time. It may take a while. It may take new experiences, but sincere understanding usually arrives naturally, not because you change to fit someone else's expectations, but because one day they began to look a little deeper. And when they do, they sometimes notice something they had never fully seen before, that some people carry a very rare kind of energy, a calm presence in the middle of chaos, a perspective open to the wider world, a heart human enough to understand that every person is carrying their own story. And that is something many Aquarius souls bring into their journey. It may not always be obvious, but once it is recognized, it often leaves a lasting impression. And here is the interesting part. By the time someone begins to recognize your value, you may already be on another chapter of your journey, a chapter where you have learned to respect yourself more deeply, to understand what you truly deserve, and to place your energy only in places that truly matter. That kind of growth is very quiet. It doesn't need proof. It doesn't need comparison. It simply appears as a calmness in the way you look at life. So, if March brings Aquarius moments that make you pause and reflect, perhaps the most meaningful part is not about who is looking back at the past. Perhaps it is about how clearly you are beginning to see yourself and the person you have become, the lessons you have carried, and the values you continue to bring into the world. And sometimes, when we look back at all of that, a very natural question can quietly appear in the heart. Has there ever been a moment in life when someone only truly understood you after everything had already changed? Stories like that are rarely loud. They unfold in ordinary moments, in small memories, in thoughts that arrive on a very quiet evening. And yet, those quiet stories are often the ones that make the human journey feel deeper. So, if you enjoy these slower conversations about astrology, about life, about the way we grow through time, there will always be a place for you here, a space to reflect, a place to listen, and sometimes to look back at your own journey. And if stories like this touch something inside you, you're always welcome to stay with the channel, so we can continue these deeper conversations in the videos ahead. Until we meet again soon, in another story beneath the wide Aquarian sky.